Good morning, everybody. Our topic today is entitled LGBT psychology, and we will also be tackling on another two titles on under gender-based violence. So we will discuss first LGBT psychology. What is this? Now, our lesson objectives for this study is discuss LGBT history and relevant LGBT terms. Explain the importance of these LGBT terms. So what is LGBT? We have lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. Now we will see what are the additional on it. We will have the plus plus later. All right, so we have this definition of terms. I will just roughly describe to you these terms. LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender are acronyms used to refer to different genders. We have a lesbian, women who are emotionally and sexually attracted to women. We have gay, men who are emotionally and sexually attracted to men. And we have bisexual, men or women who are emotionally and sexually attracted to men or women. And then we have transgender, when your gender identity, how you feel is different from your physical, was this sex, male or female. Now, labels are so important if it can be used to discriminate and oppress people, like how the German Nazis used the word Aryan race to mean superior because they are white, and Jews and homosexual to justify their mass murder of what they called as inferior race. And actually, the system of the caste system in the Indian, in the Hindu culture is actually coming from the Aryan race, because the Aryans came and colonized the eastern part of India, and so they were the ones who founded this caste system where the Brahmin is much more dominant than the Kshatriya. The Brahmins are the priests, the Kshatriya are the warriors, and you have the Shudras as the workers, and you even have the untouchables, those who are doing the what's this the lowest work, and they are looked upon. So you have this caste system, and actually it was the Aryan race, and this was also followed by the Nazis. Now, however, labels can also empower people to claim their space in our society, especially in the political sphere. Language can be used to avoid offense or disadvantage to certain groups of people, like using persons with disabilities instead of disabled. So you have PWDs, and you have the African American instead of blacks, and you have the LGBT instead of homosexual. So labels can also be positive, and it can also be used to empower people. Now, these are the views on LGBT history. Sexual and emotional attraction towards the same sex has been recorded throughout the history of mankind. In China, in 600 BCE, they used the terms pleasures of the beaten pitch and broke back. In Japan, they have shudo or nanshuko. Kathoy is used in Thailand to refer to lady boy. So I think, yeah, you can still remember the Hollywood film entitled Brokeback Mountain. In the Philippines, we have the Babaylan and the Katalunan, who were mostly women priests, but some are males who lived their lives as women. Society's attitude towards homosexuality and other gender variants changed through history. In ancient Greek, all males are expected to take on younger male lover in a practice called pederasty. Some societies, like the indigenous Native Americans, accepted and celebrated what they called two-spirited person in a dance to the berdache. However, later cultures see it as a sin, following the Abrahamic religion, which branded it as sodomy, a crime against nature. As these cultures colonized other countries, it enforced its belief system of viewing same-sex attractions as a sin through violence such as killing homosexuals, through burning, stoning, or even feeding them to the dogs. So homosexuality was classified as an illness in the 19th century, and as a basis for them to legally persecute homosexuals, imprison, and commit them to mental institution. An example of this persecution is that of Alan Turing, the father of modern computing, who was prosecuted in 1852 for homosexual acts. He was sentenced with chemical castration treatment, and later he died through cyanide poisoning. So as science advanced through years of extensive research, the APA removed homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder or as a sickness. And in 1973, this decision was after many years of struggle from the gay and lesbian liberation movement. So APA finally declared that being attracted to people of the same sex is a natural variation of human experience, and it does not make anyone less of a healthy and functioning human being. Now that society is more accepting towards the LGBT, and new terms and labels have been used to cater to everyone. Now these are the ABCs of the LGBTQ, and there's I, there's A, and there's plus. So in an effort towards visibility and inclusion, a few letters were added to the LGBT. No longer LGBT, but you have the QIA, then plus. The term homosexual sounded too clinical, and it no longer adequately represents the diversity within the LGBT community. So these labels are changing. Some you may be familiar with, but others may be new to you. So let us try to explain this as simply as we can. So we have here lesbian. They are women who are emotionally and sexually attracted to women. You have gay, men who are emotionally and sexually attracted to men. And you have bisexual, men or women who are emotionally and sexually attracted to men or women. And you have transgender, when your gender identity, how you feel, is different from your physical sex, male or female. Queer is used by people who celebrate all gender identities, can also mean someone who do not want to be restricted as lesbians, gay, or bisexual. Now you also have uh, these terms such as intersex, people who are born with sex genitals or chromosome patterns that do not fit the typical male or female body. You have asexually, ali, the word ali or sexual are people. Sexual are people who do not feel sexual attraction to anyone, but it does not mean that they do not engage in romantic or sexual relationship. Allies are straight or heterosexual people who are fighting for LGBT rights, allies. Then you have the plus. The plus sign refers to all sexualities that do not fit in the LGBTQ1 spectrum. So the knowledge on human sexuality is still evolving. So there are many terms that pops up. Here are a few to help us become more inclusive. So we have these terms such as androgynous. Androgynous means people whose gender expression or their physical appearance may or may not be distinctly male or female. And we have gender, your internal sense of being masculine or feminine or perhaps neither. Or you have gender identity, how you feel, either you are man or woman or neither. And you have a gender expression, how you express your sense of being male or female or neither, or maybe through your hairstyle, clothes, etc. And you have sexual orientation, your emotional and sexual attraction to a person. And you also have sex assigned at birth. You're given sex when you were born based on your sex organ. And you have cisgender, when your gender identity matches with the sex you are assigned to at birth. And you have non-binary, people who do not feel they're a boy or a girl, or they may feel like they're both or neither. Sometimes they use the pronouns they, them, and theirs. And there are many other terms that we have not discussed, but these are the basics and the ABCs of the LGBTQI. Now let's try to understand what is transgenderism. Okay, society attaches a lot of meanings to our biological sex, right, or physical sex. Parents knowingly set up gender-based pattern of raising their children upon knowing the biological sex of their babies. You have pink, right? Pink for boys, pink for girls, sorry, and blue for boys. It is a reflection of our heteronormative culture, wherein we expect females to be feminine and the males to be masculine. So, this limited view on sexuality makes it harder for those who do not fit in the box of masculinity and femininity, like the lesbian, the gays, and the bisexuals. It's hard for them to fit in. However, it makes so much more difficult for the transgender people, those who feel like they were born in a wrong body or they were given the wrong biological sex. So, who is a transgender? The American Association of Psychology, American Psychological Association defines transgender as an umbrella term for persons whose gender identity or gender expression or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex to which they were assigned at birth. So who is that's transgender. So this means that a transgender person does not feel comfortable. They are comfortable in their biological sex, like a person who is born male but feels like a female, and the person who is born female may feel like he is male. This feeling or gender identity is not something that changes through time, but is a feeling that they have since childhood. So this creates a problem for a heteronormative society wherein everyone is expected and forced to fit in the boxes of male masculinity and female femininity. However, history tells us that in a different culture across the world and in a different times in our history, there are people who live their life expressing a gender that is different from their biological sex. This gender nonconformity or gender crossings were celebrated by the Native Americans through the Berdache or the two-spirited people. We also have our very own Babaylan or Katalunan, pre-colonial priests who are mostly females, but some are men who live their lives as female priests. So the word transgender is also used as an umbrella term. This means there are many identities under this term. So you have the word transsexuals. For example, it is often used in the medical field to refer to people whose gender identity is different from their biological sex, and they may want to change their body so it resembles how they feel about their gender identity. A biologically male person may feel like she is a woman since she was a child, just a child, and in adulthood she may choose to have a hormonal replacement, perhaps therapy or sex reassignment surgery. Medical advancement have helped transgender people live a full life. However, it can be a long and difficult and expensive process. And there are also cultures that doesn't accept transgender surgeries. So other sexualities under the transgender umbrella term includes we have this terms under the transgender umbrella. We have FTM. FTM means female to male. So a male person whose biological sex is female and has transitioned to living his life as a male. And you have the MTF or the male to female, a person whose biological sex is male and has transitioned to living her life as a female. And you have cross dressing. Some people want to dress as the opposite gender from time to time. However, unlike the transsexual, they feel they are comfortable identifying with their biological sex. And we have drag kings and queens. These are people who dress as the opposite gender for entertainment, which they do out of passion or for work. And you have gender queer. These are people who feel like their gender does not fit the gender binary view that is limited to the male or female category because they feel that these are too restrictive. And then you have the transitioning process. So when a person realizes that he or she may be a transgender, a psychologist can guide the person through the transition, especially when a person wants to go through permanent changes like sex reassignment, surgery. So in some countries, transitioning is covered by their medical insurance and they get support from their employers and families, which is very crucial during the transitioning because it would take years to fully transition. So there are transgender people who cannot have or do not want to have hormonal replacement therapy or sex reassignment surgery because of personal, economic, or cultural reasons, and that is okay. Transitioning to another gender is a very challenging process for many transgender people because of the social stigma, discrimination and medical costs, accessibility of medical treatment and support, oppressive laws in each country, and the threat of violence from prejudiced people. Now, some countries allow for transgender people to change their legal gender from male to female or from female to male. This recognition is a product of decades of collective effort of the transgender community and the LGBTQ plus community. However, the Philippines still lack the laws and the medical capacity to support transgender people living their full potential. So the proper use of pronouns, he or she, should be observed when talking to transgender person to show respect as a decent human being. Often, when a person is clearly presenting herself as a female, by the way they dress and carry themselves, it is safe to assume that they want to use she and her. The same goes for the transgender man who is clearly presenting himself as a man, and you may use him or her. However, it is always good to practice to ask them, yes, ask them for their preferred pronoun instead of assuming, but we will do it so in a polite way. Now, let's take a look at what the Bible says about homosexual orientation and homosexual activity. The good news. So, a homosexual orientation is not a sin. Again, I repeat that there's a difference between homosexual orientation and homosexual activity. Homosexual orientation is not a sin. It is crucial for homosexually oriented persons to understand that homosexual orientation does not make them guilty of any sin. Okay? It is literally a life and death matter that we distinguish between homosexual orientation and homosexual activity. Failure to do so can drive gay believers to a suicidal despair. So we need to acknowledge that a homosexual orientation is part of living in this world of sin. Perhaps because of the environment. There are those who are raised by their aunts, so there is no father figure. Okay, so so we need to acknowledge that the homosexual orientation is part of living in this world of sin, as our babies who are born blind or suffer from heart defects. While some problems demand medical attention, others, such as moral tendencies, require the intervention of a Savior, Jesus Christ, who is ever ready to deliver those who come to Him for help. And there's a direction from which temptations come. A homosexual orientation simply describes the direction from which sexual temptation come. And it is important to understand that temptation is not sin. Again, it is important to understand that temptation is not sin. Jesus was in all points tempted like as we are, yet he was without sin. It is not a sin to be romantically attracted to someone of the same gender any more than it is a sin to be tempted to lie. It becomes sin only as this attraction is indulged in fantasy or in real life. Again, I repeat that. It becomes sin only as this attraction is indulged in fantasy or in real life. So it becomes a sin when it is already a homosexual activity. So the Bible defines sin as something we do with our bodies or our minds, not something we are. Consider that sin is a transgression of the law, and whatever is not of faith is sin. Sin involves choice. Thus, homosexual orientation does not make anyone more sinful than a heterosexual orientation does. It is what we choose to do with our sexuality that may be sinful. Okay, so that ends our discussion about LGBT. Now let's move on to our next discussion entitled Gender-Based Violence. So this is coming from this unit entitled Political Legal Perspective in Gender and Sexuality. So we will be discussing about the second section, we will be discussing about gender-based violence. Survivor, victim, perpetrator, and we'll also discuss human rights. So our objectives for this lesson is to understand the definition of gender-based violence and other related terms, and its forms and consequence. Understand gender-based violence as human rights issue, determine the relationship between human rights and gender-based violence, and differentiate perpetrators, survivors, and victims in gender-based violence. Now, uh, as we would continue, so gender-based violence, what are these, and how we'll be able to tackle this issue. So gender-based violence is one of the most widespread and human rights abuses, but least recognized in the world. Again, gender-based violence is one of the most widespread human rights abuses, but least recognized in the world. It refers to harm perpetrated against a person's will on the basis of gender and the socially ascribed differences between males and females. So gender-based violence has devastating consequences not only for victims, but also for society as a whole. It results in physical, sexual, and psychological harm to both men and women, and includes any form of violence or abuse that targets men or women or on the basis of their sex. So in the Philippines, gender-based violence has clearly been placed in the realm of women's human rights over the past decade. Prior to 1993, most governments regarded violence against women largely as a private matter between individuals. So now I want you to get a piece of paper. Please get one of piece of paper, and I want you to answer this. Okay, like for 4 minutes, I want you to answer this. What is the consequence of this gender-based violence in terms of? Okay, so in one half sheet of paper, I want you to answer this for about 4 minutes. What is the consequence of this gender-based violence in terms of? Number one, social consequence, economic consequence, and health consequence. Okay, so I'll give you 3 minutes or so to answer this. So you're finished? Okay. So gender-based violence experienced by women and girls refers to battering and other forms of intimate partner violence, including marital rape, sexual violence, dowry-related violence, you have female infanticide, sexual abuse of female children in the household, you have honor crimes, early marriage, forced marriage, female genital cutting, and other traditional practices harmful to women. Sexual harassment in the workplace and educational institutions, commercial sexual exploitation, trafficking of girls and women, and violence perpetrated against domestic workers. So gender-based violence cuts across public and private spheres. It includes, the home, the school, the work, and takes place during peacetime and conflict. It is both a human rights and a development issue with negative consequence for both women and men. So the consequence of gender-based violence. Now, this consequence includes serious, immediate, and long-term impacts on the sexual, physical, and psychological health of survivors. Health consequences include unwanted pregnancies, you have complications from unsafe abortions, STD, sexually transmitted infections or disease, including HIV, injuries, mental health, and psychosocial effects, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, suicide, and death. They have also violence, also affects children, survival, development, and school participation. Social consequence extend to families and communities. Families can also be stigmatized as a consequence of a gender-based violence. For example, when children are born following a rape, or if family members choose to send by a survivor, fellow members of their community may avoid them. So we have economic consequences include the cost of public health, social welfare system, the reduced ability of many survivors to participate in social and economic life. So you have survivor, victim, and perpetrator. So what are these? Okay, so survivor is preferred term, not a victim, of a person who has lived through an incident or gender-based violence. Okay, so survivor is the preferred term of those who was able to live through incidents of gender-based violence. So they should not be termed as a victim, survivor who had lived through this, but experienced gender-based violence. A perpetrator is a person, group, or institution that inflicts, supports, or condones violence or other abuse against a person or the group of persons. So the characteristic of perpetrators include a person with real or perceived power, a person in decision-making position, and a person in authority. So in all incidents of gender-based violence, or we call this a GBV, there is always a survivor. So there's a survivor, he is the victim, but we should call it survivor, and there is the perpetrator. Therefore, all actions in the prevention and responses to gender-based violence need to address both the survivor and the perpetrator. So preventing and the response of all the actions of this, this should address the survivor and the perpetrator. Now we will just skip this activity. We will go directly to human rights. Okay. Now, what is human rights? Now, before that, now let us remember the words we use to communicate a message to people who are listening. Survivor is preferred term for those who live through a gender-based violent incident. A perpetrator is the person who commits an act of GBV. And there might be one perpetrator or more. In any of this act, there is a survivor, perpetrator, and all actions in prevention must address potential survivors and potential perpetrators. Okay, and we have human rights. What is human rights? Human rights are universal, inalienable, indivisible, interconnected, and interdependent. And everyone is entitled to all rights and freedoms without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin. Prevention and response to gender-based violence is directly linked to protection of human rights. So acts of gender-based violence violate a number of human rights principles enshrined in international human rights instruments and in Philippine Constitution. So this includes the rights of life, liberty, property, the right to highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the right to freedom, okay? So gender-based violence is a worldwide phenomenon which must be given attention nationally and internationally. The consequences capture almost all spheres of our lives. We have family, social, economical, and health. So the main focus of gender-based violence is violence against women, affecting women, girls across their lifespan. Was this vow, violence against women also covers continuum of violence, which appeared to be an ending with an array of elements of abuse, coercion, or force. The survivor and perpetrator are important factors in gender-based violence and violence against women cases. So the gender-based violence and violence against women are clear violations of human rights. All these point to the essence that these acts of violence are global and of national concern. Okay, so now let's go to our last topic: gender-based violence, power, use of force, and consent. Okay, so we had tackled about human rights, okay, gender-based violence against women, and now we will go to what are these terms: power, force, and consent. So our objectives for this study is to identify a relationship between abuse of power and gender-based violence. Understand that the term violence in the context of gender-based violence means using some type of force, means which may or may not include physical force. Not understand the meaning of informed consent and its relationship to gender-based violence. In the early sessions, we have discussed what gender-based violence and was this agents, subjects who are involved in it. We have the survivor, we have the perpetrator, among others. So this session explores the meaning of three important concepts: what is power, the use of force, violence, and informed consent. So what is power? Okay. Power, perpetrators can have a real or perceived power. Some examples of different types of power and powerful people are the following. We have social. This refers to peer pressure, bullying, leader or teacher, parents. And you have economic. The perpetrator controls money or access to goods, services, favor, sometimes the husband or the father. And you have political power, elected leaders, discriminatory laws, the president of the US. You have physical. It refers to strength, size, use of weapons, controlling access or security, soldiers, police, robbers, gangs. And you have gender-based social. Males are usually in a more powerful position than females. And you have age-related. Often the young and elderly people have the least power. So power is directly related to choice. The more power one has, there are more choices available, right? The less power one has, fewer choices are available. Unempowered people have fewer choices and are therefore more vulnerable to abuse. So gender-based violence involves the abuse of power. An equal power relationship can be exploited or abused. How about using of force? Violence. Force might be physical, emotional, social, or economic in nature. May also involve coercion or pressure. Force also includes intimidation, threats, persecution, other forms of psychological or social pressure. The target of such violence is compelled to behave as expected or to do what is being requested for fear of real and harmful consequences. So violence consists of the use of physical force or other means of coercion such as threat, of inducement, or a promise of a benefit to obtain something from a weaker or more vulnerable person. Using violence involves forcing someone to do something against his or her own will or to use force. That's violence, right? So that's the use of violence. Now, uh, what is in the last one is informed consent. So consent means you're saying yes, agreeing to something. Okay. Informed consent means making an informed choice freely and voluntarily by persons in an equal power relationship. So acts of gender-based violence occur without informed consent. So gender-based violence happens when the person, when the person would not want it. It is against his or her own will. Even if she says yes, this is not true consent because it was said under duress. So the perpetrator used some kind of force to get her to say yes. Though the person said yes, but the person was forced to say yes. Children under age 18 are deemed to unable to give informed consent for acts such as female genital cutting, marriage, or sexual relations, those who are under 18. Okay, and we have the cycle of violence. The cycle of violence refers to repeated acts of violence in a relationship. It starts with minor incidents and moves on to more serious levels of violence. So the cycle of violence may start in a child who is a victim or a witness to violence and may be repeated when the child becomes an adult. So the impact of being a victim or a witness to violence on a child is pretty much traumatic. It can make a child scared, unhappy, lonely, lose self-confidence, blame themselves, lose sleep, and pick up fights with peers. So children should understand that having conflict is all right, but resolving conflict through violence is not right. Having conflict is all right, but resolving conflict through violence is not right. When children understand violence is not acceptable, they will grow up into adults who respect other people. So, power and abuse are some integral components of gender-based violence. These components also had an effect to the consent to be given by the survivor. So consent may be informed or vegetated on which violence is perpetrated. So this violence plays along a cycle of being empowered, overpowered, and giving of consent to the detriment of women and their children. So thank you, everybody. We had already discussed what is LGBT and how we'll be able to rightly address it. We also had discussed gender violence, human rights, and we had understood the differences of violence and power. So I hope that you had learned something out of this. And then later on, please do answer the assessment posted in the middle. Again, answer the one posted in the Moodle, and also check your own attendance this coming Thursday and work on your assessment. And please also participate in the forum. Thank you, everybody, for joining in class, and let us bow our heads for prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you, dear Father, for giving us this afternoon, for giving us, dear Father, this opportunity to be able to discuss our discussion. Please help us, our Father, to be able to understand this, that we may be able to rightly relate to others. Teach us, the Lord, to love as you have loved, and to be able, dear Father, to be a blessing. Thank you so much, our Father, for guiding us, for bless the students. They continue with the studies. This we ask in the love name of Jesus Christ, we pray. God bless everyone, and have a good day to all. Bye-bye.